You won't believe what happened the day a power-hungry HOA Karen tried to storm into our off-grid cabin, screaming about unauthorized structures and code violations, only to be stopped dead in her tracks when my wife handed her something she never expected, a federal warrant. Before we jump into the chaos that unfolded deep in the pine-covered woods, take a moment to subscribe to Sham Stories for more real-life neighborhood showdowns and HOA takedowns you'll never forget. It all started when my wife Laura and I decided to leave city life behind after years of battling overpriced rent, overcrowded streets, and relentless stress. We bought a secluded log cabin just outside the HOA boundaries of Pine Hollow Estates, or so we thought. The cabin came with 10 acres of land, a bubbling creek, and complete solitude, everything we dreamed of. We spent months fixing it up ourselves: solar panels, rainwater collection, composting systems, all legal, all sustainable. We made sure of that because we didn't want trouble. But trouble found us anyway, in the form of a woman named Karen Wilford. She was the self-appointed president of the Pine Hollow HOA, and seemed to think she was running a military base instead of a sleepy mountain subdivision. One day while I was trimming brush near the driveway, I noticed an SUV idling just past the gate. It had no official markings, just a vanity plate that said Roulets 1. I didn't think much of it until the same SUV showed up again 2 days later. This time, pulling into the gravel loop in front of our cabin. That's when I met her. She stepped out in khaki slacks, a blue button-up shirt with a name tag she clearly made herself, and an attitude that could split granite. "This is private HOA business," she barked, before I could even say hello. "Where's the permit for your compost toilet?" I blinked. "You're not on my property legally," I said calmly. "And we're outside HOA jurisdiction." "That's in the county land record," she scoffed. "All properties within 300 feet of Pine Hollow roads fall under HOA oversight. Section 4, paragraph C." She pulled out a binder the size of a dictionary and started flipping pages. "We'll see about that," I told her, and politely asked her to leave. Instead, she circled our property on foot, muttering and snapping pictures. She was there for nearly an hour before leaving, vowing to return with enforcement. Laura and I shrugged it off at first. But over the next week, we received 3 printed notices taped to our gate. Each one claimed a new violation: illegal solar setup, unsafe water collection, non-permitted structure, our garden shed, and unregulated livestock, referring to our 3 chickens. Laura, a former paralegal, took each notice and filed them away. "None of this holds up," she said confidently. But then we received a certified letter saying our property would be subject to an external inspection within 72 hours, authorized by the HOA Enforcement Committee. That's when things stopped being amusing and started getting serious. The final straw came that Saturday morning. Khan showed up in a tan vest with an embroidered badge that said Community Compliance. Officer and 2 men with clipboards in tow. "We're here for the full inspection," she shouted, not even bothering to knock. "Under HOA bylaws, you're obligated to comply. You're not coming in," I told her from the porch. "Not unless you have a court order." "Have something better," she snapped, waving a laminated page with a signature at the bottom. "A notice of administrative override." Laura stepped out behind me, calm as ever, holding a sealed envelope. "Actually, I think you'll want to see this first," she said, handing it to Karen. "What is this?" Karen asked suspiciously. "A letter from a real court. A federal one." Karen's hand trembled slightly as she tore it open. She read. Her face went pale. "This says you're under investigation." "It's not us," Laura said coolly. "You." The men with clipboards looked at each other nervously and began backing away from Karen. "You've been unlawfully impersonating code enforcement officers and trespassing on private property under color of authority," Laura continued. "This warrant allows for seizure of any materials or records used in the commission of those acts." Karen started stammering. "This is a mistake. There's no way this isn't even real." "It's signed by a federal judge," Laura said, pointing at the seal. "You may want to call your lawyer." Karen didn't move. For a long, awkward moment, we all stood there, quiet of the woods broken only by the chickens scratching in the dirt nearby. Then she turned stiffly and walked back to her SUV without a word. The clipboard men followed, both of them throwing apologetic glances over their shoulders. When the vehicle backed out and disappeared down the winding road, Laura turned to me and said, "Well, I guess that's one way to spend a Saturday morning." But little did we know, this was only the beginning. What Karen did next would escalate things to a level we never expected. She wasn't going down quietly, and she definitely wasn't done. Processing what had just happened, the air still thick with tension and the distant echo of tires on gravel. It felt like a victory in the moment, but deep down we both knew that people like Karen didn't just slink away in defeat, they regrouped and retaliated. Sure enough, not even 48 hours later, we began to notice strange things around the property. Someone had pried open our mailbox and rifled through the contents. The rainwater collection barrels were knocked over one morning, with fresh boot prints in the mud nearby. Even the chickens were spooked. Their coop door found ajar with feed scattered across the grass like someone had tried to scare them. It was petty, childish even, but clearly pointed. Karen wasn't going to risk direct confrontation again, especially with a federal warning issued against her. Oh, she was now playing the long game. Intimidation, sabotage, pressure. Laura called the county sheriff's office to report the incidents, but they told her there wasn't much they could do without direct evidence. "It's probably just wildlife or neighborhood kids," they said with a chuckle, even as Laura insisted we didn't have neighbors close enough. And our trail cams had been mysteriously disabled. That was the final straw. We decided it was time to escalate things ourselves. Laura contacted her old law firm, where she still had some allies from her paralegal days. Got us in touch with a civil rights attorney named Brandon Keats. Brandon specialized in property rights and HOA abuse cases. And after reviewing everything, the forged notices, the illegal inspections, and the bogus override form, he agreed to take us on pro bono. "She's operating a rogue enforcement racket," he said during our first video call. "This kind of thing has happened in isolated HOA communities before, but rarely this blatantly. If we push, we can bring the whole thing down." Armed with legal firepower and renewed confidence, we started collecting every bit of evidence. We installed new cameras, this time wired, camouflaged, and secured in metal cases up in the trees. We archived every notice, every envelope, even the voice messages Karen left when she thought she was being clever. Most chilling was the one where she said, "People like you think you can hide out here, but Pine Hollow has rules. If you don't respect them, you don't belong." A veiled threat, sure, but it reeked of entitlement and desperation. Then one night, around 1:15 a.m., our cameras caught something that made Brandon call in additional help. Karen had returned. Not alone, but with two men wearing dark clothes, flashlights in hand. They crept up to the tool shed near the side of our cabin and started cutting the lock. As soon as the bolt clattered to the ground, floodlights snapped on from our porch and Laura hit the siren switch wired to our system. The intruders bolted, Karen tripping over a root and scrambling to her feet like a deer, all caught on high definition. Video this time? The sheriff couldn't wave us off. We drove straight to the department that morning, gave them the footage, and filed charges for attempted burglary and trespassing. Even the desk sergeant raised his eyebrows. "This is your HOA president?" he asked, pausing the footage on Karen's panicked face. "You're telling me she's been sending you legal documents without county approval?" "Worse," Laura said, "to fabricated authority." That's when the sheriff got involved personally. Within the week, he visited Pine Hollows. According to his report, Karen refused entry until presented with a search warrant. When they returned with one, they seized 5 boxes of unregistered paperwork, blank violation forms, and a USB drive labeled camera logs. The logs revealed something even more disturbing. Karen had been monitoring several other residents with similar tactics, including hidden surveillance footage taken from bushes and trees around private homes. One file was titled Cabin Freaks, and it contained dozens of pictures of me and Laura in our garden, fixing the roof, even just sitting on the porch drinking coffee. We felt violated on a level that's hard to explain. This wasn't about rules or standards. This was obsession. The sheriff's report triggered a formal investigation by the county oversight board, but it also stirred up something else. Other victims, one by one, families and individuals from Pine Hollow and the bordering properties came forward with their own stories. A retired couple whose firewood pile was cited as excessive outdoor clutter. A single mom who was fined for having a non-regulation mailbox. A young veteran who received 10 violation notices in a single month for everything, from a hammock in his yard to the unauthorized use of a barbecue grill. Karen had been running a reign of terror, and most people either paid up or moved, a way to avoid conflict. But now the tide was turning. At the next emergency HOA meeting, called by the remaining board members after, Karen was suspended. Over 50 residents showed up. Some brought folders of their own violation notices. Others carried signs that read "No more tyranny" and "Our properties, our rights." Brandon spoke on our behalf and detailed the legal ramifications of HOA overreach and abuse of power. By the end of the night, a vote was held to dissolve the current board entirely and bring in an external management firm vetted by the county. It passed with 92% support. Karen didn't attend the meeting, but everyone knew where she was, awaiting a court date and possible charges. And yet, despite the legal wins, despite the evidence, despite the community rising up in solidarity, Laura and I still couldn't shake the unease. It wasn't over. Not really. Because people like Karen don't accept consequences, they seek revenge. And somewhere out there, we knew she was still watching, still scheming, still ready to come back with another twisted plan. We had protected our home, yes, but we weren't just fighting for ourselves anymore. We were standing up for everyone who had been silenced, pushed around, or made to feel powerless. And we knew the real showdown hadn't even started yet. By the time Karen's preliminary hearing date was announced, Pine Hollow had transformed from a fearful, attentive, tightly monitored community into a united front of homeowners demanding accountability. And although many breathed easier knowing she was no longer patrolling the streets or sending bogus citations, there was still a collective unease about what would happen next, especially when it became clear that Karen had retained a high-powered attorney known for defending disgraced politicians and corporate executives. Laura and I watched closely as the legal process unfolded, especially since our footage and testimony were at the center of the case. But instead of cooperating, Karen turned aggressive, filing a counterclaim against us and the newly appointed HOA leadership for emotional distress, defamation, and unlawful harassment, alleging we had orchestrated a smear campaign to remove her from her rightful position. The audacity was staggering. Her lawsuit claimed that we had maliciously entrapped her and manipulated public perception using selectively edited video. It was clearly a bluff, a legal stunt to stall the criminal case or create leverage, but it complicated things, especially for the others involved. Brandon, our attorney, called an emergency meeting with us in the HOA's transitional board. She's trying to create confusion, he explained. If she muddies the water enough, the DA might back off or settle the charges quietly. Laura leaned forward, furious. So she breaks into our shed, harasses our neighbors for years, impersonates an officer, and she's the one crying victim now. Brandon nodded grimly. It's a typical scorched earth tactic. She can't win, she'll try to destroy the battlefield. The HOA board voted to formally defend against Karen's civil suit using reserve funds, and that gave us breathing room. But the battle was far from over. Every day brought new letters, new filings, and even subtle threats. Our mailbox was smashed twice in 1 week. A dead squirrel was left on our doorstep one morning with a tag that said, "No, your place." Though we had no proof it was her or her allies, the timing was too suspicious to ignore. Laura responded by upgrading our security yet again. More cameras, motion lights, even a private server to store all video remotely in case someone tried to wipe the footage. We also started getting calls from local journalists after the court. Documents were made public, and suddenly the story was no longer just about a rogue HOA leader. It became a headline: Backwoods Power Struggle. How a cabin couple took down the HOA Queen of Pine Hollow. Reporters reached out for interviews. A local podcast invited Laura to share our side. We were hesitant at first, but eventually agreed to a sit-down interview with a regional station to get ahead of Karen's twisted narrative. Laura did most of the talking, calmly recounting the timeline, the evidence, our motivations, not revenge, but justice, she emphasized. That our goal was never to destroy anyone, only to stop the abuse and restore peace. The segment aired 2 nights later and quickly gained traction, sparking public outrage and a renewed call for HOA reform in the county. More former residents came forward with stories of being forced out by Karen's oppressive tactics. One man said she harassed him until he sold his home below market value, while another elderly couple claimed she threatened them with fines if they used their RV for overnight guests. What had once been scattered whispers now formed a tidal wave of support. But still, Karen didn't retreat. Instead, she doubled down. She released her own video, standing on the porch of a rented cabin, calling herself a wrongfully accused patriot and claiming she was the victim of a deep conspiracy led by anti-community radicals who hated rules and wanted anarchy. She blamed us directly, pointing to our militant behavior, hoarding of surveillance tech in defiance of civil order. It was equal parts laughable and dangerous, especially as the video racked up views from fringe HOA loyalists and conspiracy theorists. Some even began showing up in Pine Hollow to investigate, wandering the streets with phones and live streams, filming homes and making residents nervous all over again. The sheriff increased patrols, and Brandon filed a motion to have Karen's video entered as evidence of further intimidation. But the real game changer came when one of Karen's former board members, a man named Alton Briggs, broke ranks and approached the DA's office with a flash drive full of internal emails and records. In those emails, Karen outlined plans to expand her reach into adjacent neighborhoods, describing how to gradually assert soft governance over non-member properties like ours by manipulating ambiguous clauses in the bylaws. She even referred to certain homeowners as targets of opportunity, including a list that prominently featured our names. The flash drive also included discussions about how to skirt county oversight, including using untraceable personal funds to issue fines and hiring off-duty security officers to maintain order. It was the smoking gun the prosecution needed. With that new evidence, the DA added charges of racketeering and fraud to Karen's case. Her civil countersuit collapsed within days, withdrawn without explanation. But still, she refused to plead guilty, instead requesting a jury trial, one that would drag everything into the open. Laura and I were summoned as key witnesses. The weeks leading up to the trial were surreal: subpoenas, depositions, more media coverage. But as stressful as it all was, we felt something new rising in the community unity. Neighbors began helping each other more. People who'd once been isolated by fear now chatted freely at the community center, shared stories, organized cleanup days, and even voted to rename one of the streets Peace Hollow Lane in symbolic protest against Karen's reign. When the trial finally began, the courtroom was packed. Local news crews lined the sidewalks. Karen entered in a tailored gray suit, defiant but rattled. Her once confident stride seemed forced, her eyes darting nervously. The prosecution laid out the case clearly, methodically, using our footage, Alton's flash drive and witness testimony, to show how she built a private empire on fear and deception. Laura testified first, calm, direct, unflinching. Then it was my turn. I described the trespassing, the threats, the sabotage, the look on Karen's face the moment she realized she wasn't in control anymore. Karen's defense team tried everything. They painted her as misunderstood, claimed she was overzealous but not malicious, and said the residents misinterpreted her passion for order. But the jury didn't buy it. After 3 days of testimony and 6 hours of deliberation, the verdict came down, guilty on all counts. Karen's sentence wasn't lengthy, just under 2 years. But the court also banned her from serving on any HOA or community board for life. As she was led away in cuffs, I watched her glance toward the gallery, eyes hollow, mouth tight. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She just vanished through the side door, and it felt like a chapter finally closing. But as we stepped out of the courthouse and the sun hit our faces, Laura turned to me and said, "You know, this isn't the end, right?" I nodded. No. But it's a damn good start. Because while Karen was behind bars, The system that allowed her to operate unchecked was still very much alive in Pine Hollow. In other towns, in boardrooms and basements, and self-important little councils across the country, we weren't just survivors anymore. We were witnesses, advocates, and we weren't going to stay quiet. Not now. Not ever. After Karen's sentencing, Pine Hollow began a slow transformation that felt like watching a storm-damaged forest start to regrow, cautious, uneven, but undeniably alive.
Ow.
The cabin community came together with a kind of energy we hadn't seen before, as though the years of fear and submission had been replaced by purpose. Without Karen's obsessive oversight, neighbors who'd once whispered at HOA meetings or silently paid absurd fines now spoke openly, questioned rules, and proposed reforms. The interim board formed quickly after her arrest, held emergency sessions to begin dismantling the corrupt structures she had built. Laura and I were asked to join a newly formed ethics committee, tasked with reviewing years of citations, appeals, and disputes filed under Karen's regime. It was sobering, going through the paperwork pages and pages of residents fined for things like wind chimes, porch flags, small garden plots, or even unauthorized roof colors. Some people had lost savings, others had sold homes just to avoid the harassment. One elderly veteran had paid nearly $15,000 in landscape violations and was now living in a rented trailer 20 miles away. When we contacted him, he broke down on the phone. "I didn't know I had a right to fight it," he said. She made it sound like she was the law. We invited him to speak at a community meeting, where he received a standing ovation and a full reimbursement from a newly established HOA relief fund. That fund, started with legal settlement leftovers and private donations, became a symbol of the healing underway. But not everyone wanted healing. A small group of Karen's loyalists, dubbed the silent fence line by residents, remained skeptical, even hostile. They blamed us for ruining a good thing, insisting that Karen kept the neighborhood safe and respectable. They claimed the new leadership was soft, that Pine Hollow would turn into a lawless wasteland. At one meeting, a woman named Margaret slammed her notebook down and shouted, "This is what happens when people who don't follow rules get power." Laura stood calmly and responded, "No. This is what happens when the people finally stand up to someone who abused theirs." That tension lingered, and so did the fear that someone else might try to take Karen's place. The bylaws hadn't been updated in over a decade, and much of the language was vague enough to allow future manipulation. That's when the residents voted unanimously to rewrite the HOA charter entirely. It became a community-wide project. Lawyers volunteered. Families hosted cookouts while editing drafts. And for the first time in years, people weren't hiding behind fences. They were meeting face to face. Still, Laura and I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't finished. Karen might have been sentenced, her hold broken, but her actions had left scars, legal, emotional, even structural. The surveillance systems she'd set up were still installed on various homes. Some of them had recorded private conversations without consent, feeding data to a private cloud service we later learned was based in another state. We had to hire a cybersecurity firm to map the network and trace the source, eventually discovering that Karen had contracted a third-party monitoring service using HOA funds. That service, VistaGuard Solutions, had been collecting and storing footage from Pine Hollow for years, claiming it was community safety data. When confronted, they refused to release the full archives without a court order. So we went back to court. This time it wasn't criminal, it was a civil demand for data access, launched by the HOA board and backed by a coalition of privacy rights advocates. The case sparked a second media storm, one that went beyond Pine Hollow. Soon other HOAs across the state began looking into whether their own surveillance programs had similar contracts. State legislators got involved, proposing new HOA transparency laws and digital privacy protections. Our quiet little corner of the woods had become the center of a much bigger fight. Meanwhile, back in Pine Hollow, something strange began happening. At first, it was small mail tampered with, trash bins overturned, a resident's tires slashed. But then one evening, Laura caught movement on our security feed, a hooded figure walking the edge of our yard, carrying what looked like a tablet. By the time we got outside, they were gone. The footage was grainy, but the walk, the stance, it was familiar. You don't think she? Laura started to say, then stopped. Karen was in county jail, with no scheduled release. But that didn't mean she was working alone. A week later, we received an anonymous package with no return address. Inside was a USB stick and a note. You wanted truth? Be careful what you ask for. We ran the drive through a secure system and found hundreds of encrypted documents, email chains, receipts, maps, and photos. Many we'd already seen, but others showed correspondence with individuals in neighboring communities, suggesting Karen had been attempting to set up a county-wide HOA alliance, complete with unified bylaws and enforcement patrols. One email read, "If we can consolidate under one set of rules, we can finally remove these fringe elements once and for all." She'd been planning a regional takeover using Pine Hollow as her prototype. The final document was a letter titled, Phase 2 Contingency. It laid out a backup plan in the event of her arrest, instructing unnamed allies to sow doubt, destabilize, and discredit the new leadership by any means necessary. It included our names and our address. We turned everything over to the sheriff's office, who launched an investigation into potential accomplices. Several of Karen's former allies were questioned, though none were arrested, but the sense of threat returned. Laura began carrying pepper spray again. I reinforced the gate. For weeks, nothing happened. But then one night we heard footsteps. On the roof. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, shining the beam up. A young man in dark clothing was crouched near our chimney, holding what looked like a camera. When he saw me, he jumped down the backside and ran. I chased him to the tree line, but he vanished into the dark. The sheriff's deputies found nothing. No fingerprints. No evidence. Bo had scratched the word traitors into the side of our shed. That was when we decided to go public again. We held a town hall, invited media, and shared the USB drive contents with the broader community. We made it clear Karen might be gone, but her influence was still trying to cling to power. It would only succeed if people stayed silent. The community rallied again, more determined than ever. We formed a neighborhood watch, not the petty spying kind Karen had weaponized, but a real one focused on safety, communication, and mutual respect. Volunteers patrolled in pairs, rotating schedules, checking on vulnerable residents and keeping an eye out for anything suspicious. I started weekly barbecues to build morale. Laura hosted book nights. Slowly, the fear began to lose its grip. Pine Hollow was healing not just from Karen's rule, but from the paranoia she had nurtured. People were remembering what it felt like to live in a community instead of a compound. And through it all, Laura and I stayed vigilant, because we knew what power looked like when it turned sour. We knew what it cost to let one person take control unchecked. We knew how easily quiet compliance could turn into complicity, and we weren't about to let that happen again. Not here, not ever. A few weeks after the neighborhood had found its footing again, just as autumn painted the trees around Pine Hollow in fiery reds and deep golds, received a phone call from an unfamiliar number that made my stomach twist the moment I heard the voice on the other end. "You thought it was over," the woman hissed, "but I've only just begun." It was unmistakably Karen. The tone, the smugness, the coldness, underlined with resentment. I hung up immediately and called the sheriff, only to learn that Karen had recently filed an appeal from her jail cell. Not only that she had requested a temporary transfer to a lower security facility due to mental health concerns, and, somehow, the court had granted it. She wasn't walking free, but she was certainly far more mobile than she should have been. I relayed the call to Laura and the HOA board, and within hours, Pine Hollow was on alert again. That night, during an emergency board meeting, one of the new officers, Dale, dropped a bombshell. He had been approached in the parking lot of a grocery store by a man who claimed to be a federal investigator, looking into HOA corruption, but who asked extremely personal questions about our security protocols, meeting locations, and voting procedures. Something wasn't right. We reached out to local authorities and later confirmed there were no federal agents assigned to our HOA or even in the region conducting such operations.
Oh.
The man had lied. Cameras from the grocery store gave us a blurry image, but Dale identified the vehicle, a black Ford sedan with temporary plates. Whoever this was, they were watching us. For a week, we barely slept. The community was holding strong, but the sense of unease that had taken months to scrub away was creeping back like mold beneath wallpaper. One evening we found one of our pet goats dead behind the shed. No wounds, no obvious signs of trauma, just cold and stiff.
Ow.
The vet suspected poisoning, but we had no proof. Then, as if trying to prove to us that she was still in control even behind bars, Karen filed a lawsuit from jail against the HOA for wrongful removal and emotional damages. The complaint was ludicrous, citing obscure bylaw amendments that she herself had fabricated years earlier. But the legal system had no choice but to hear the case. We were drawn back into court again, standing before a judge while Karen, peering via video, smirked from a sterile room in a facility that still gave her internet access and an attorney. The community packed the courthouse gallery in solidarity, and this time, the judge saw right through her game. The case was dismissed in under 10 minutes. Karen didn't scream, didn't flinch. She just stared coldly at us through the screen and said, "You think this is justice? You have no idea what I've prepared." The sheriff later told us they found a hidden notebook in her cell, filled with addresses, names, sketches of houses, and notes that read like war plans. Karen had been strategizing even while incarcerated, using her limited privileges to gather and send information through coded letters passed to visitors. A deeper investigation uncovered that two of her former HOA officers, those who had resigned but never spoke out, had been corresponding with her under false names. One was arrested. The other fled the state. The judge, alarmed by the depth of her manipulation, reversed the previous leniency and ordered Karen transferred to a higher security facility with no further access to outside communication. Finally, it felt like the last nail had been driven into the coffin of her reign. In the weeks that followed, Pine Hollow truly changed. The relief wasn't just procedural, it was cultural. People laughed louder, kids played longer into the evenings, porch lights flickered on for guests instead of inspections. The new bylaws passed by unanimous vote, officially dissolving the old enforcement structure and replacing it with a council system of resident volunteers with term limits and rotating chairs. Laura and I declined further leadership roles, preferring to return to the peace we originally sought when we bought the cabin. But every once in a while, we still checked the cameras, locked the gates a little tighter at night, and exchanged a quiet look that said we weren't letting our guard down, not entirely. A local newspaper did a follow-up story titled "The Cabin That Fought Back," painting us as community heroes. Flattering. It felt odd to be praised for simply defending what was right. But it did give the movement we helped spark a new name: Cabin. Just as HOA reform groups around the country began calling it that whenever residents stood up against abuses of power. One evening, sitting on the porch with a glass of wine and watching the sunset stain the hills orange, Laura turned to me and said, "Can you believe this started with her just screaming about our gate color?" I laughed, a real laugh, and shook my head. She underestimated everyone. She thought fear would keep her safe, but it just made people stronger. That weekend, we hosted the first annual Pine Hollow Farron event, once banned under Karen's regime for being too chaotic. There were booths, games, live music, and more than 100 guests. The final event of the evening was a bonfire. And just before it was lit, the crowd gathered as the HOA board brought out a metal box. Inside were items from Karen's rule: an old violation notice clipboard, a recording device, a copy of her original bylaws, and a laminated HOA compliance inspector badge she used to wear on a chain around her neck like a dictator's medallion. The board gave a short speech about the importance of never letting power go unchecked, then dropped the box into the fire. People cheered as it burned. Sparks flew high into the sky, and with it, the last trace of her authority. That night we slept soundly, windows open, no cameras on, no alarms set. We had earned that peace. And yet somewhere deep down, I knew that stories like ours weren't isolated. In neighborhoods across the country, there were other Karens, other abused powers, other people too afraid to speak. That's why we kept the documents, the files, the court transcripts. We started a website. Not just to tell our story, but to give others the tools to tell theirs. And they did. One by one, we received emails from strangers with tales even darker than ours. Families fined into foreclosure. Veterans evicted for flags. Elderly widows spied on. Single moms harassed for toy clutter. The stories poured in, and the fireweed started in our small cabin, caught wind and spread, may have lost, but the fight for fairness had only just begun. And to everyone watching, listening, and nodding because you've seen your own version of her in your neighborhood, don't wait. Stand up. Push back. You're not alone. We were just a couple trying to enjoy a quiet life in a cabin. We never wanted a war. But when it came to our door screaming, we answered. And we won. If you want more gripping, real-life inspired HOA dramas and neighborhood justice stories, make sure you subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel, where silence is broken, voices rise, and Karens everywhere. Learn what happens when the people finally fight back.